Wizard, and today we are learning about Hegel. Of course, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirits, Part 15. So, still in the preface, but we're learning a lot of really great stuff. Going to read what I just wrote about the summary from last week to jog everybody's memory. And here we go. I said, I mean, this might be wrong. I need to write these like right after I finish instead of a week later. But anyway, in this section, Hegel talks about the need for philosophy to analyze or otherwise to break down an idea into its constituent parts. Then he goes on to say how these parts each become their own whole, separate from that overlying idea, in which it gains its own kind of consciousness and stuff like that he was talking about there, or like its own spirit, if you will. Thus outlining the power of the negative, which is an ability to kind of kill ideas that you thought was true and to alienate it and then see how it fits back into the whole. All right, so this process of breaking an idea down and giving it life on its own, which may be stillborn, like it may die in the end, it may die shortly thereafter, but by separating it and trying to analyze and see how it works and see how it fits back into the whole idea, you can get a better understanding of what you are trying to understand. And Dr. Sattler adds on to all this. He says, lets us know that Hegel centers around this idea that toiling or otherwise tarrying with these concepts are a key element of philosophy. He points out how it's part of the process to not know if the work you are doing um, will. I may have wrote that wrong. I have to fix that. But anyways, the work you're doing to explain and understand the world will even lead anywhere. So he basically says there's a lot of dead ends, right? The process of knowledge and learning and thinking is full of dead ends and a struggle and strife and whatnot. So yeah, that's all what we covered last week in sections 31 and 32. Now we're going to jump into sections 33 and 34 of the preface. Let me go ahead and share this screen here. All right, and now let's learn. I gotta come up with the fun catchphrase in the beginning.
The fact that the object represented becomes the property of pure self-consciousness, its elevation to universality in general, is only one aspect of formative education, not its fulfillment. The manner of study in ancient times differed from that of the modern age, in that the former was the proper and complete formation of the natural consciousness.
Mm.
Putting itself to the test at every point of its existence and philosophizing about everything it came across, it made itself into a universality that was active through and through. In modern times, however, the individual finds the abstract form ready-made. The effort to grasp and appropriate it is more the direct driving force of what is within, and the truncated generation of the universal, than it is the emergence of the latter from the concrete variety of existence.
Yeah, so we already talked about this part before, but yeah, this is a great point, right? Every time existence made itself into a universe that was active through and through. In modern times, however, the individual find the abstract form ready made, right? So basically, before they had to kind of start from scratch, right? They kind of had to look at the world and see what the hell is going on, right? You see mountains and you see the sun and the weather and all this other stuff, and there's no scaffolding in place. There's no idea of what's going on, right? So now, like we are on the shoulder of giants. We use their scaffolding that they've developed and understanding the world to go even further, right? Beyond. It's not that we're smarter. It's not that we're necessarily more evolved per se either. Or at least in the sense of being again smarter or better than they had before, is that we are standing on their shoulders, right? We It's ready made for like these abstract concepts of how the sun works, right? Just think about that, how day works, how day and night works. Before, you had no idea how this worked. Like really, rather, the ideas that you had were inherent, what we would call spiritual, right? This idea of the gods in heaven, moving things around, or it's kind of a magical, or what most other people, kind of consider magical ideas or spiritual ideas. That when you look into the sky, you see this giant light come up, and at night you see all these, flashing lights in the sky, and it seems like something is alive out there, something is looking down upon you, and all this other stuff. And of course, you're going to come up when you're trying to explain the world, like they're just as curious as we are. So when you're trying to explain the world, like how does where this light comes from, why it's so normal, regular, if you will, but at the same time it kind of moves around at different times. But you have no idea of space, right? You have no idea of, you know, uh, the universe and everything like that. So of course you're going to come up with, oh, somebody put that up there, for that, and all this other stuff. Like I don't have to. I'm spending a lot of time there, but in essence, it makes sense why people had these concepts. They're very abstract, but now we understand it's very concrete, right? Like we know that there's our sun up there, and that we have the moon, all these planets, the stars. We understand the mechanics of the function of the eclipse, or rather the ellipticals, the orbit, and stuff like that. We can explain all this stuff. So we're just standing on their shoulders. Anyways, I'm going far too long here. Welcome, Omar. He says, I felt this way when I was in school. We aren't really doing our own intellectual work and just citing and quoting everyone else work who quoted other people. Also, hello. Yeah, hello. And yeah, definitely. Exactly. Exactly. Again, this is not necessarily a bad thing, right? This is not necessarily a bad thing. However, it becomes a bad thing very quickly because we're not really taught to value what came before. We're not really taught to give respect to the fact that these people had nothing, right? And then they came up with all these mechanics and everything like that. Versus us, it's good that we're quoting them and that we're citing them, but then if we assume that, oh, we're better because we know better now, like that's not really how education and how knowledge works, right? Knowledge works because somebody toiled to get there, and we now have to toil to get beyond. And we some say we even have it harder because we should be able to toil to figure out what they did and how they figured that out. Like this is what Hegel was talking about as well, right? The effort to grasp and appropriate it is more the direct driving force of what is within and the truncated generation of the universal than is the emergence of the latter from the concrete variety of existence, right? I might be misinterpreting this, but to me, it's like we still have to do that. We still should do that process. Um, Catherine McLaughlin, I'm not sure what you're saying here. V at Vask Tech, and you have the I don't know what you're saying there, but thank you for commenting, I guess. But let's continue here.
Existence. Hence, the task today consists not so much in purging the individual of an immediate, sensuous mode of apprehension and making him into a substance that is a object of thought and that thinks, but rather in just the opposite, in freeing determinate thoughts from their fixity, so as to give
See?
actuality to the universal and to impart to it spiritual life.
Right.
But it is far harder to bring fixed thoughts into a fluid state than to do so with sensuous existence. The reason for this was given above. Fixed thoughts have the I, the power of the negative, or pure actuality, for the substance and element of their existence, whereas sensuous
Mm,
determinations have only powerless, abstract immediacy, or being as such.
mm.
Thoughts become
So basically, right, it's easier to start from to have a fluid, mentality, have a fluid idea of the world, or I guess he calls it the sensuous existence. I think that's what he's referring to, but it's far harder to bring fixed thoughts into a fluid state than to do so with sensuous existence. Oh, okay, so the reverse, you know. Yeah, yeah. So what we have today are kind of fixed thoughts. Like we're less abstract, more mechanical, things like that, in a lot of ways. Some ways we're still fairly abstract and fluid, but those are like the edges of what we know, right? The ways in which we're fluid are all the spaces in which are on the frontiers of our science and understanding and knowledge and things like that. And this sensuous existence is like our perceptions, right? At least that's how I'm seeing it. Our perceptions seem to give us a clear mechanical view of the world. I sense it, therefore it is. I hear it, I taste it, and all this other stuff. Therefore, it is how it is. But if you that creates a fixed mentality, right? That makes you think that, when I feel this phone, feel this object, it's a physical concrete object. But it's not, right? Like we know that physical objects are, 99% vacuum or whatever, you know. And once we look into it, we actually realize that there's a whole lot of fluidity going on here. But you have to detach that from your senses. You have to kind of, make it abstract again. Um, and that's, I guess, what he's saying here. And to continue that, thoughts become fluid when pure thinking, this inner immediacy, recognizes itself as a moment, or when the pure certainty of self abstracts from giving up the fixity of its self positing. right? By giving up not only the fixity of the pure concrete, which I itself is, in contrast, which is differentiated content, but also the fixity of the differentiated moments, which posited an element of pure thinking, share the unconditioned nature of I. I realized as I was reading that I didn't, read this part. But yeah, I think it just follows, into what we were saying before. And that it's a whole like when we begin to identify, with our thoughts, with our perceptions, with our understanding of the world, and say, oh, okay, this is how I see the world, therefore it is. Then we begin to it becomes harder to break it down, to um make it more fluid, to make it more abstract, and things like that, right? We kind of have to separate it from ourself and from itself in order for us to really engage with it more, and to move it around, to toil with it, to see, to look at it from different perspectives. At least that's how I
Fluid when
interpret
pure
this.
thinking, this inner immediacy, recognizes itself as a moment, or when the pure certainty of self abstracts from itself, not by leaving itself out or setting itself aside, but by giving up the fixity of its self-positing, by giving up not only the fixity of the pure concrete, which the I itself is, in contrast with its undifferentiated content, but also the fixity of the differentiated moments, which, posited in the element of pure thinking, share the unconditioned nature of the I.
Hmm.
Through this movement, the pure thoughts become notions, and are only now
There's
what
that
they are in
notions again.
truth: self-movements, circles, spiritual essences, which is what their substance is.
Mm. Let's break this down. See what
So in
Dr.
section
Savage
33, we're
says.
following up on what happened in section 32. In section 32, we saw that through the power of the understanding, through the power of the negative, human being, as consciousness, is able to, you might say, tear itself out or extricate itself, to estrange itself from the matrix of what it was engaged in analyzing. And it begins to realize that it is something over and against, and thereby mediating with what it is that it understands, what it comes to know. And Hegel says the fact that the object represented becomes a property, that is, belongs to, is a possession of pure self-consciousness, that makes it into something universal. When I think camera, for example, I have this camera in particular, but I also have a conception of camera, and I understand what a camera does. And I can compare this camera against, the notion or the universal conception of camera. I have that. That's something that is in me in relation to that. That's part of that mediation within myself to outward objects, and also within myself, making sense out of things. So Hegel says, look, you've got this whole process of development that's been taking place in which it gets more and more integrated, more and more complex. That's part of what he calls Bildung, or formative education. Now, if we look at world spirit as developing through history,
Hmm.
we have one single process of this, or you can also call it culture. And yet every single generation also has to approach this and appropriate it for itself. That's part of the process of becoming uncultured, of becoming a person within a given time, who is not
Exactly.
just an abstract, isolated moment, but who is able to benefit from this past, to appropriate it to oneself.
Hmm.
So the question is, how do we do that in the modern period as opposed to the ancient period? Here he's going to have another contrast that he's already begun to unpack before. He said,
Hmm. And before he even gets into that, I think what he might mention, I like to make predictions on what might be talked about here. But like how in the fact, maybe he won't mention this exact thing, but the fact that in many before writing, right, it's really difficult to pass information on. So even if some people, like philosophers, of those times, were able to figure out some things, it was really difficult just because we didn't have the tools in place to communicate that knowledge to other people, right? So each culture had to figure out how to figure out these things by themselves on their own, um, and each generation had to do it again as well, right? Unless you happen to be in a academic kind of environment or be connected to one of these philosophers in which you can go to school with them, the early, levels of early examples of school, or um, if you were in these places where they talked about this sort of thing, like you rarely ever learn these things. While today, we have the internet. Anybody can go in and Google, how this stuff works, or watch videos about it and things like that, and instantly you're caught up, with all that time, with all that knowledge. Granted, it can once again become a handicap, because if you don't engage in that process yourself of trying to understand how they got here, then you take it for granted, right? Then you kind of assume that what you learned is 100% true, right? You kind of assume that everything you see is the knowledge, is the product, but we know it's a process. So it's okay to you kind of jump in later in the process, but it's important to do a retrospective and look back and see, okay, this is how we got here. Trace yourself back here. Then you have more understanding of how you got here, and then you can kind of analyze and self-assess and be more healthily skeptical of different types of claims and stuff that you see today. But yeah, anyways, I went off track there, but I do think a huge part of the ancient way of learning, and this was even somewhat true in Hegel's time, right? Even though he probably thought himself a modern time, and that they had books and libraries and schools and academia and things like that, same thing, but they had ways of propelling that knowledge. But now we have way better ways of propelling that knowledge. So now Hegel's time seems ancient compared to us. But the point is that before they couldn't really pass on information very easily. Each person and culture institution had to um, recreate that information, had to re understand how things worked, and they couldn't really build on each other's knowledge very easily. While I'm on this topic too, I do wonder, and I would love to hear thoughts from you all as well, if you're listening right now live or later on. What are ways do you think that we be able to have a better way of doing this in the future, right? Like when people look back on our time in 100 years, 200, 1,000, right, or whatever, and now the 21st century, is the ancient time, right? How will they what would be the progression of their knowledge building? Like, how will people learn this sort of thing? I think you'll hear the usual stuff, like of maybe you have direct brain computer interfaces and some sort of hive mind type of thing, so everybody can instantly share information between minds. I think that's something a lot of people will bring up. But what would be the ramifications of that, right? Like, I imagine we would have a far like more just a better knowledge base of the understanding the universe. But I don't know how to say this. I also think it would be really interesting to kind of think about and consider the impact of the individual life, right? In which, similar to today, where you can instantly Google anything to learn, how the world works and things like that. I wonder what would be the impact of having direct brain computer interfaces or direct brain to brain, you know, interfaces in which you can instantly upload all of humanity's knowledge at any time. How will that affect how science is done? All right, how will that affect how we communicate with each other, how we build on culture and knowledge and philosophy and all this stuff? Like, how will that affect that? I have some ideas. I might have to spend some time doing a podcast on that, but think about that. I would love to hear what you all will say about that, because it seems we're getting progressively more like progressively better at dispensing knowledge. Sometimes that's for good, sometimes that's for ill. Because once again, if the knowledge is thought of as a product and people don't really criticize or toil with understanding it, then they can take things for granted and assume things to be true when it's not. You know, could you like what would alternative facts or basically false information look like when you can instantly spread memes and false information mentally, right? So this could be good or bad, and I want to explore that. But anyways, let's get back into this.
As the manner of study in ancient times differed from that of the modern age, in that the former was the proper and complete formation of the natural consciousness. Natural consciousness is, what begins at any given epoch. So, for example, taking an iPad as something that's just part of our landscape is part of the natural consciousness for, anybody who's, say, 21 and down at this point. Maybe we have to adjust that upward. I don't want to get into little quibbles about that. But you see what I'm saying there. For me, a cell phone is something different than it is for my children. Because I remember a time when phones were, for the most part, rotary and had cords and they were generally plugged into the wall. And then you got the touch-tone ones, and eventually cordless phones. What a liberation that was. Those are all parts of the natural consciousness of any given point in time. Another example, a contemporary example would be paying at the pump. That was a weird thing for me for a while, in part because that wasn't that wasn't an aspect of my natural consciousness. Our natural consciousness is our way of being in the world at any given time. So when we're looking at ancient cultures and how they developed culture that was then transmitted, there's a natural consciousness, and what natural consciousness does is it, like he says, puts itself to the test at every point of its existence and philosophizes about everything that it comes across. So it runs into things and says, what the hell is this? What's that? What's this? Let me taste this. Let me try this. And he's not talking about every single human being at this point. He's talking about the people who are making progress in ancient times. Should I attack that guy? I don't know. I'm kind of scared of dying, but let's see what it's like. That's part of this process that he's talking about, putting itself into the things that it's studying, putting itself into its test. It made itself into a universality that was active through and through. So starting out from what we can call abstract being, immediacy, sensuousness. Sensuousness, he doesn't mean something like, erotic or anything like that. What he means is being a being in the world that we perceive with our senses, that we make sense of, and then stripping ourselves away from a complete reliance on that. Mm-hmm. So Plato, for example, in conceiving of form as being something distinct from matter and saying that there was a world of the forms that was more real, was tearing himself away from purely sensuous existence. But so is anybody who threw themselves into battle and risked. We'll see why when we get to later discussions in the Phenomenology. So what is the achievement there? Universality. Making something fixed, because the immediate, the sensuous, those are like all over the map. It's this, as William James called it, booming, buzzing confusion. And what took place in ancient culture was making things be what they were. That was an achievement in Hegel's view. So he says, it made itself into a universality that was active through and through. In modern times, in our times, the individual finds the abstract form, what it was that was achieved through hard work, through labor, through generations in the past. They find this abstract form ready-made. The effort to grasp and appropriate it is more the direct driving forth of what is within and the truncated generation of the universal than it is the emergence of the latter from the concrete variety of existence. So we have the products of this process of developing culture, and our tendency is to take them for granted as being fixed things, to lose sight of what was actually attained, what was achieved in that process, and to treat them as mere things, even to treat them as mere commodities. This is not something entirely new to the moderns. Lucian, I think I may have mentioned this in another video, has this wonderful satire about the book buyer, the person who stocks their library with all these books, never reads them, and thinks that by having the inert objects there, they somehow possess the knowledge, which is something active, something dynamic. That's
maybe we might one day.
That's a danger for us. Textbooks are particularly bad for that. I think that a lot of popularizations of things have a tendency to do that as well for us. So he says, the task nowadays is not so much purging the individual of an immediate sensuous mode of apprehension and making that individual into a substance that's capable of thinking about themselves and that can fix themselves into something, but rather it's just the opposite. We start out with these determinate fixed thoughts, and what's really underlying them, we're going to see, is the abstract, the concrete, the purely concrete I that is within all of us. So he says, freeing determinate thoughts from their fixity so as to give actuality to the universal and to impart to it spiritual, and I've got this capitalized, life. Why do I have life capitalized? Well, what is life? Life is a process of ongoing becoming, of appropriating, of integrating, of choosing, of making distinctions. It's active. It's not something passive that takes in...
Sorry, my alarm. Got to put a post up on the social media, trying to get myself to do that more. But anyways, I like that. Life is the so you said the actualization. No, the shit. I'm terrible at memorizing. Let me see.
Life is a process of ongoing becoming.
Life is a process of ongoing becoming. Life is a process of ongoing becoming. I like that.
Of appropriating, of integrating, of choosing, of making distinctions. It's active. It's not something passive that takes in these fixed thoughts and then just sort of processes them and uses some sort of algorithm to make sense of them. No, what we have to recover is this sense of activity and actuality. That's what's at loss. That's what we miss in the modern period. Hegel thinks that we need more of that kind of negativity. So he says, fixed thoughts have the power of the negative or pure actuality for the substance and element of their existence. That's what makes them tougher to unfix. Because that's tougher than abstract being is. Abstract being for Hegel is just, you walk around and you encounter things and there they are, and you can get to know them a little bit now. This we bring with us everywhere. And in the modern period, we've become aware of ourselves as this pure I. Through Descartes, through Hobbes, through Kant, through our conceptions of freedom, through our very view that it's important for us to figure out who we are and to determine ourselves. Hegel's getting at that makes it more likely for us to take on these fixed thoughts as fixed things and not bring back to them the fluidity that they really need. And how do we do that? Well, by reflecting upon ourselves. That's what this process of spiritual life is.
Right.
So he says, thoughts become fluid when pure thinking, this inner immediacy, recognizes itself not as the be-all and end-all, but as a moment. Remember how we talked about moments being part of a whole? Recognizes itself as a moment, or when the pure certainty of the self abstracts from itself, not by leaving itself out, not by setting itself aside, because it's important, it's part of the big picture, but by giving up its fixity of its self-positing. So, if we want to use Descartes, for example, imagine if Descartes said, maybe I am more than just thinking substance. Maybe in some weird way my body does matter to me more, which, by the way, he actually read the letters to Princess Elizabeth and the Passions of the Soul, and you'll see the beginnings of that. Merleau-Ponty recognized.
Hold up, I gotta take note on that. The letters to Elizabeth or of Elizabeth? Heart. Oh, just Elizabeth. Okay. Interesting. Princess Elizabeth. And what was the other one? Passion of the Soul. Yeah. Nice. Opinion is one dedicated to Princess Elizabeth by Harmia. I bet you it's a love poem. Or maybe not. They just had a completely, non-romantic relationship. No, but this is pretty cool. I had to look this up.
So he says, by giving up not only the fixity of the pure concrete, which the I itself is, but also the fixity of the differentiated moments, which posited in the element of pure thinking, share this unconditioned nature of the I. We have to be willing to learn what it means to be an I, to be a subject. That means that we have to stop taking so many things for granted. That doesn't mean that we forget everything, or we act in some pure vacuum where nobody knows anything, but rather we have to be willing to allow things to be as active as they are and to see our own role in contributing to what they are. That's difficult. That takes work. So he says, through this movement, pure thoughts become notions or concepts, begriffe. That's what the process of the phenomenology is charting out. He says, now they are what they are in truth. Self-movements, circles, spiritual essences, which is what they're substances.
Excuse me.
So when we actually do that, when we carry out this process of formative education, and we get away from just relying on determinate fixed thoughts and start moving towards notions, we're going to encounter them, and they're going to encounter us, and they're going to have a kind of agency because they possess a, sort of like he says, self-movement.
Right.
That's scary for a lot of people. The good news is, of course, that we're going to see that they're actually reflections of ourselves. But we're not going to see that right away.
All right.
This movement of pure essences constitutes the nature of scientific method in general. Regarded as the connectedness of their content, it is the necessary expansion of their content into an organic whole. Through this movement, the path by which the notion of knowledge is reached becomes likewise a necessary and complete process of becoming, so that this preparatory path ceases to be a casual philosophizing that fastens onto this or that object, relationship, or thought that happens to pop up in the imperfect consciousness, or tries to base the truth on the pros and cons, the inferences and consequences of rigidly defined thoughts. Instead, this pathway, through the movement of the notion, will encompass the entire sphere of secular consciousness in its necessary development.
Yeah, that's a simple one there. But
in this section, number 34, and in the very short section, 35, that follows, Hegel's kind of bringing things together now. There's this constant ebb and flow, introduce new notions or new ways of looking at things, consolidate them together. And so now he's going to return to talking about scientific method, which is how Miller is translating this long German word, Wissenschaftlichkeit. Wissenschaft, we've talked about this plenty. That means science. Lich is like, kite, the state of, the condition of. So the condition of actually being scientific, of being along the lines of science. What is that? Now, the reason I bring that up is I don't want you, when you see method, to immediately think back to chemistry class or biology class or natural science and think, oh, the scientific method.
This is a very interesting moment right here, or kind of aspect. Again, it goes back to that idea of language and how language very much kind of dictates how we think, right? Or at least forms, modes how we think, right? In English, Reviewing as a scientific method, right, implies that this is the method, right? This is the process of how things are done. Is a very specific type of thing, right? You do this, you do that, you do that. That's kind of what we think of when we think about method. But this is they have vision like okay. I'm sorry, but it seems like it's one word and a compound word to communicate this overall feeling, what he said, the condition of doing science or something like that, right? That's amazing. That's an amazing freaking concept to have in your brain as a word, as a phrase, as a you know thing that your language does, right? English, unfortunately, tends to be a little bit too um I don't know. I want to say objectivist, right? Like we have this problem with English language in which things are very binary, right? Where it's all about, this is a thing, right? When I say thing, I mean this thing. Like, when I say a pronoun, his, her, I believe to individual or whatever, things like that. And it makes our mind too rigid, right? A little bit too fixed, if you will, to kind of go back to Hegel. The very language of English is not fluid enough to really explain these different concepts. We have to string a lot of words together, to describe and explain and make metaphors and analogies to kind of get this sort of understanding, this the vision, like whatever, like the condition of doing science. That's amazing. I wish we had like a word for that, like, that's cool.
Method, as we were taught back then. Because remember, science is something broader for Hegel because it has to encompass the human. It has to encompass the person who's coming to know, the person who's conceptualizing, and make that part of the process as well. And that's one thing that science, in the sense that we think of it today, doesn't really do adequately and doesn't teach people how to do well enough. So his notion of scientific method is going to be a bit different. And he says, this movement of pure essences constitutes the nature of scientific method in general. So what is he talking about there?
Hmm.
This is referring back to the previous section. The movement of pure essences, or thoughts, that we were finishing up with at the end. These were fixed and they have to be transmuted into notions, into begriffe, into concepts, into some sort of dynamic thing. And this becomes, instead of just a movement, which is being carried out upon them, it has to become a self-movement. That's part of what makes them notions. So he says this movement of pure essences constitutes the nature of scientific method in general. There's something about the systematic, the integrating function of science that gets us to move away from fixed thoughts that we just take for granted as being familiar and look at them and allow them to come to life as dynamic wholes,
Right,
dynamic concepts, dynamic notions. So he says, if we think about this in terms of the connectedness of their content, the fact that each one of these things that we're studying is connected with the other things, that there's no, you might say, scientific, hermetically sealed containers with biology over here and physics over here and history over here with nothing to do with each other. If we reject that sort of notion, and we
Yes, we
say,
should.
actually these things are connected with each other, once we start realizing that connectedness, that moves us towards looking to try to have some sort of organic whole. So these are words that, again, to use the defamiliarization, we really ought to spend a little bit of time defamiliarizing ourselves from organic whole, because people often talk in terms of holism or things being organic, they sort of arise. Hegel doesn't actually mean it in that sense. He thinks that this is going to be differentiated, complexly connected together, it's going to be articulate, it's not going to be some vague, loosey-goosey sort of thing, it's going to be very rigorous. So he says, through this movement, the path by which the notion of knowledge is reached becomes a necessary and complete process of becoming. So there's two elements there. Necessary, that means that we can actually sort of follow it out and say, this needs to come from here. It's not necessary in the sense of logic, the logic that we're used to teaching in the schools of formal logic. Rather, it follows its own developing logic that can only be seen from the vantage point of seeing it once it's developed. That's where the completeness comes in. But notice that he's talking about the notion of knowledge, the begrip, the conception of knowledge. Knowledge itself is not a simple relation of me to the content. I'm actually included within that concept as the knower of that. And that, in turn, that what it is that's being known is going to be...
All right, this is great stuff, but I keep distracting myself in my brain because I keep holding up on this idea of organic and how what he's saying, like people kind of see organic as a thing that's kind of loosey goosey, as just like, oh, it is what it is. that kind of threw me for a little bit, and I got distracted. So I'm gonna have to go back a little bit, but it boggles me that people think that, right? Because for me, when I think about organic, I simply think about a thing that is, self-organizing, right? That is that can grow, that can move and change and adapt and evolve over time. Like it, you know, that's for me, that's the difference between something that's organic and inorganic and things like that. And so when I think about an organic idea or an organic concept or even in organic technology, right? I think about something that that can attain a life of its own, that can grow itself, that can change itself, and things like that, right? And so, therefore, for me, it's not that in our for me, I didn't have to really what he says defamiliarize the term organic, because for me, it is systematic, right? You can have life, and you should, kind of explain life in a way that is fully explainable. The problem, or really the catch there, is that you can never get there. It's like it's like perfection. It's asymptotic, right? Like you can never get to an idea that's completely perfect, because we're always learning more. Just like with organic things, I it is unfortunate, and I have to recall back to other people. But when I do speak to other people in terms of ideas of something that's organic, or this idea of life, I do have to remind myself that, oh, people think, for many people, they view life as something that is almost a magical, mystical thing, that, and once you explain something, it takes the magic away, right? It makes it less, interesting. But for me, when I explain something, when I seek to get an explanation for something, it actually introduces more magic, right? For because I don't know, like maybe that's just because I'm freaking weirdo, or just because I read a lot. I'm a nerd. But when I explain or look to get an explanation for something, right? I realize that there is so many more questions. Whenever you explain how something works, you get even more questions of how that works and how that works and how that, and you can go ad infinitum, right? You never really get to the bottom of it. And that's, to me, is so much more magical. That, to me, is so much more organic. It shows that life is incredibly complex, and you can never understand all of it. However, we should still pursue that explanation. We should still try, right? Because by trying to understand more of it, by trying to get a full explanation, we can constantly, that's an easy way of constantly growing and learning more. And so for me, yeah, like uh, something that is organic is to me like immediately like full of things that we need to learn. And it can be, it can and should be systematic, you know, rigorous, all that good stuff. But it's not, it's not like opposing the organicness, if you will. Like I don't know if I'm explaining all that, but uh, just overall, it just kind of threw me for a loop a little bit to remember that, oh, people view life as something that you don't need to explain, or you can't explain, or you shouldn't explain, or whatever. But I think you can, you should. Um, and we might never get there within our lifetime, or even within humanity's lifetime, but we can always try, right? And that's the kicker. It keeps you humble, right? To realize that as much as we know about different things about life and reality, there's still so much more that we don't know, right? And by constantly seeking to learn more and keeping ourselves open to the idea that we might be wrong about how we see the world today, we can still keep learning more. We can maintain our level of progress and understanding. But anyways, let me get off my soapbox and go back a little bit, because I did miss that.
Notion of knowledge, the griff, the conception of knowledge. Knowledge itself is not a simple relation of me to the content. I'm actually included within that concept as the knower of that. And
Right.
that, in turn, that what it is that's being known is going to be incorporated into me. That's what mediation, which he's not actually using the term for here, that's going to come into play in this sort of thing. We should always think mediation when we're reading Hegel. We should always think that there's always connections between things.
Mm.
So he says, this preparatory path ceases to be a casual philosophizing that fastens on this or that object. Again, we see this emphasis on defamiliarization, on not just taking whatever happens to come along, whatever our age happens to tell us everything's all about. If we actually have historical perspective, we realize that's very arbitrary. What we
Right.
want is to grasp what's really essential to human beings, human development,
Mm.
to the march of spirit. Not just what our age at this point in time.
That's a good point too, right? And I that's a good correction on what I had said before. Like I was saying before that we should, go back and see how they got here. But really, the key is not necessarily figure out how they got here, because or he's right. Like it is kind of substantial or not substantial. It is kind of contextual. It's kind of random almost in a way. And like it doesn't really matter how they got here. What matters is what they used to get here. It's not, like it doesn't matter like, oh, they had to they viewed it this way and in this way. It's like look at the essence of how of I guess I should get a better way to describe that. But basically what he said, right? Like we should understand um the essence of things, not the essence of things, that goes into the whole essentialism stuff. I don't really like that. But the toiling with how to bring different ideas together, right? And what brings things together and why it is that way and things like that. um Focusing more on the concepts and things like that rather than the individual mechanics of what they use to get there, right? Like we don't need to know how Newton came up with Newton's law of gravity and stuff like that. We need to learn, what makes Newton's ideas useful today, and where does it fall short, and why do we use Einstein's general theory of general relativity in certain of those areas, right? Like that's what we need to know. So yeah, it's a great correction there.
Time in this place with this discourse happens to tell us, and we happen to digest and assimilate and assume, and then regurgitate back out
Mm.
as good consumers of information, we want to exercise a little bit more responsibility and care, because that's part of what it means to realize the potentiality of human being.
Mm.
Not just to have knowledge in the sense of having accumulated a lot of things in your head, or even some vague notion of being able to apply it, but actually being able to conceptualize in a rigorous, systematic way
Mm.
that takes you into account and places you in human history what this knowledge business is about. So he says, we want to get away from just casual philosophizing that fastens on this or that object, relationship, or thought that happens to pop up, or tries to base the truth on the pros and cons, the inferences and consequences of rigidly defined thoughts. Instead, what we're looking at is the movement of the notion, the
Mm.
movement of the concept. And again, we can talk about this in terms of like the march all the way through history, up to Hegel's time. Or we can think about it in terms of something that every single generation faces as part of the necessity to reappropriate, reassimilate, and thereby learn what it means to be fully human, to make themselves part of that movement of the notion. So Hegel sees these two things as intimately connected. The movement of the notion through history, through these stages of consciousness,
Hmm.
is really about developing knowledge. Now that may strike you as really weird. That wait a second. So wars are somehow about knowledge. So economic processes are about knowledge. So the interplay between divine law and human law, or the family and the state, those are all about knowledge. Those seem like really practical matters having to do with action, with choice, with values, with decision. Hegel would say, well, actually, that's all still part of knowledge,
Hmm.
insofar as it's the human being trying to come to know themselves. And things like the good, the just, the right, are parts of
Yeah.
that movement towards knowledge. So he says,
Because why do we do much of this? Like a lot of the reason why we even do this, a lot of these wars and economics and stuff like that is based on a philosophy, right? Some sort of philosophy based on the idea of, oh, I have a right to be here. Everybody has a human right to do this and that and the other, and therefore, I'm gonna wage war and protect people from this or that and the other. And, might be wrong, might be right. It doesn't matter, like, or it does matter, but the fact is that it's a inherently philosophical you know exercise. People say, oh, what's the point of philosophy? Everything, right? The way we make our laws, how we justify our ethics and morals and things like that. The technologies that we want to create, how we do our education system, the value of our economics, and why we think capitalism is good or bad, or democracy, or everything, right, has to do with our philosophical understanding of the world and how we grasp what's right and wrong, what's true and false, and all this other stuff. And that trickles down or plays into everything about our reality and our social interactions and things like that. So this is why everybody needs to learn philosophy, right? Because if you don't, then you automatically assume whatever you think is true without any sort of critical, thought behind it. You have what Hegel was saying earlier as a kind of, surface level philosophy, as kind of um a non what's it call it, like I forgot the exact words, but you're not demanding enough from philosophy, right? You're not really explaining much about the world. You don't have a solid understanding about the world. You kind of take it all for granted, right? And that is a bad thing. That consistently creates so much opportunity for abuse, misuse, really terrible accidents, or purposeful violence and things like that. So yeah, philosophy, philosophy is so very important. Um, and yeah, I just love that Hegel and Dr. Sally here is talking about that.
This is going to encompass the entire sphere of secular, that is Weltliche, consciousness in its necessary development. So everything that's taken place in the world, this is very ambitious, isn't it? Everything that's taken place, at least the essential things through human history, have to be brought into this as part of the movement of the notion and as part of what goes into knowledge. Now, Hegel in 1807 had a much easier vantage point than perhaps we do. This is one of those points where you might say, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to buy into the whole Hegelian shtick, the whole Hegelian picture of what's going on, because a lot has happened since Hegel. But the question that you could ask yourself then is, well, is Hegel's basic approach able to say, okay, new things have developed since then, new shapes of consciousness. They've taught us something about knowing that goes beyond where I was able to be. Could we chart that out and reincorporate that? So that would be the question that you'd want to ask.
I
But
think so.
what he's talking about here is what it means to really be scientific, once again.
Beautiful, beautiful. Once again, really beautiful stuff, really awesome stuff. And let me yeah. Hey. So yeah, it's dope, man. And I think we can use that same concept, that same, kind of framework of this method, this science process to describe, the world we live in today, whatever that is for you when you're listening, when you're watching this. Because a lot of this stuff is still relevant. A lot of the stuff that we're reading, the thing that we're hearing, like I think at least it's still relevant. It's still we can apply it to how today is kind of functioning, and if anything, it's even more relevant, right? Because at least in terms of the 21st century where we are today, we have an even more kind of consolidation and bringing together of all these histories and cultures and knowledge and understanding and languages, and all this stuff is just coming together, right? um and I'm super curious to see once again where Hegel is going with this, and where he went wrong, if he did. Why we're not using more of this today. Why we aren't talking about this more. Maybe it's probably I honestly my kind of uh assumption so far as to why we're not talking about it is simply because it's too complicated. Right? It's too hard. um, I'm only, 15 sections in or 15 videos in, 30 sections in. And I probably have years worth of videos to watch before I get to the end of this book. Right? And I'm taking my time with it, of course. But even if you try to read this whole thing through, I've been in the comments, looking at the comments, and a lot of people talking about, oh, I tried to read this one, two, three, four times, and I still can't really grasp all this. So that's why a whole lot of people like Dr. Seidler doing this, because it helps them to understand what the hell Hegel was talking about. This is visionary stuff. Like this is like Einstein level, in my opinion. Einstein, or I guess the German, way of saying it. But like I think to me it seems like real genius stuff. But unlike Einstein, he didn't have a simple, elegant, way of describing all of this. Right? He didn't really appreciate that. Like he didn't really, that's not the point of this. Like the point of this is to make it a huge, ambitious, hard process so that people have to engage in it. But unfortunately, that's a lot of friction, right? That makes it very difficult for many other people to read through this whole thing, to go through this whole process, to engage in all this stuff. But I would argue that we can simplify this, not the concepts itself, but we can actually communicate the value of doing this process, and that's simply that knowledge requires effort, right? It's kind of like the simple, elegant, equation of all of this. Um, if I'm interpreting, Dr. Sadler here correctly, is like, knowledge requires effort, and if we want to have a good understanding, if we want to have a good body of knowledge, then we have to go through this effort for profit. That we have to put forth the effort to attain that knowledge, to criticize that knowledge, to update that knowledge, to grow that knowledge, um, individually and socially, right? As individuals in our individual consciousness, as well as the world consciousness, the overall culture, we have to put forth that effort. But yeah, as always, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think about this, what you learned from this. If you agree, disagree, or have other thoughts around this stuff, I would love to hear what other folks think, and have gleaned from this. Um, Thanks for getting this far if you did. And tomorrow we're going to be continuing, reading Anarchy, the Anarchy Primer. So check that out. Usually shorter videos. And yeah, have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.